I recently got the chance to watch the critically panned Sony film Madame Web, and while I don't necessarily want to beat on a dead horse here, I do have to admit that the movie was pretty fucking bad. The story follows a New York City paramedic named Cassandra Webb, who begins to develop signs of clairvoyance after a near-death experience. Forced to confront the revelations about her past, she must protect 3 young women from a mysterious adversary who wants them dead. And you know what? That premise isn't all that terrible. It actually sounds rather interesting if you ask me, but the story itself isn't exactly what is wrong with this movie. The problem lies in the execution. Now, S.J. Clarkson seems like a pretty solid director. She's worked on many critically acclaimed shows like Orange is the New Black, Succession, and even Jessica Jones, so I'm sure she's capable of producing some good material, especially since the direction in this movie wasn't even all that terrible, even if I wasn't particularly impressed with it either, which means that I don't really blame Clarkson for the quality of the film overall. But I do blame Sony, and that's because I am absolutely positive that Sony interfered with the production of this movie during every step of the way. Meaning that the finished version of Madame Web that played in theaters was not the movie that Clarkson set out to make in the first place. And I know that is the case because the actors who starred in the movie admitted as much. So if you're wondering why Dakota Johnson and Sydney Sweeney keep distancing themselves from this film, it's because this is not the movie they signed up to make, which may explain why they appear to be so stiff and lifeless in the final product, but I don't think they deserve any hate for the performances they gave, because I'm sure they're doing the best job they can with the material they were given. And while I did actively like Adam Scott's performance here, since his depiction of Ben Parker allows us to see a side of Uncle Ben that we've never really got to see before, Scott's portrayal of the character is probably the only positive thing that I have to say about this movie. Of course, if Sony actually cared about the quality of Madame Web, I'm sure they wouldn't have hired the exact same writers from their critical failure and box office disaster, Morbius. Which probably explains why the character development is so thin, why the dialogue is so awful, and why the plot is filled with so many stupid little details. Like how there's a group of spider women and an entire village of spider people whose very existence makes Spider-Man feel irrelevant, how Cassandra Webb could be mad at her own mother for dying in childbirth, how Cassandra doesn't even have any basic social skills whatsoever, despite the fact that she is a paramedic, and how the NSA has technology that could identify people in someone's dream in 2003. But my favorite bit is how the villain Ezekiel Sims manages to actively put himself into harm's way, like jumping up and into the direct path of an oncoming vehicle. I don't even understand Ezekiel Sims as a character. He wants to kill the Spider Women cause they might one day kill him in the future? Why? What kind of shit does he get up to? Why did he want spider powers in the first place? What is this man all about? I have no idea, and that's because Sony doesn't have any idea either. But that's exactly how Sony operates. They want to make as much money as possible while putting in as little effort as possible. Why else would Uncle Ben or May Parker or Peter Parker himself be in this movie, especially when they don't need to be? So Sony could advertise the film to Spider-Man fans without having to commit to including Spider-Man in the actual movie. which feels so incredibly cynical to me. But that's the Sony way for ya. They're going to keep making these shitty-ass movies because they think we as the audience are stupid enough to just enjoy whatever slop they put out, especially if they slap Spider-Man's name on it. And it's for that exact reason that I would never endorse any of these Spider-Man adjacent movies. The Tom Holland films work because Marvel took over creative control. The Spider-Verse films work because Lord and Miller are in full creative control. But these films don't have a cohesive creative vision. They're made by a corporate committee who are learning all of the wrong lessons from this film's failure. Instead of looking inward, reflecting on how their own cynical executive decisions led to a mediocre film like Madame Web, Sony wants to blame the poor box office on their female leads and their female director, which is incredibly stupid considering the huge success of Barbie and the massive failure of Morbius. So, Dakota Johnson is not what is wrong with Madame Web. Her performance is a little wooden, but she is completely serviceable here. Sydney Sweeney, Isabella Merced, and Celeste O'Connor are not what is wrong with the movie either, because it's not their fault that their characters are frustratingly one-dimensional. Tahar Rahim is absolutely terrible in this movie. His performance as the villain is probably my least favorite aspect of the entire film, but plenty of MCU movies are fine even in spite of having a weak villain. So Madame Web is a terrible movie because it suffers from a more systemic problem from within Sony itself. And until they begin to fix said problem and trust in the vision of the creative people they hire, I'll have no interest in supporting their shallow and cynical comic book films. Which means that Madame Web would definitely not get a recommendation from me.